Well, today is the day when I'm going to start another podcast series for my YouTube channel, which my son Samuel and I have been talking about for a long time. Provisionally, I think I'm going to call it How History Helps. What prompted this idea is that I happened to be writing a book on the life of Molly Blackburn, who was killed in a head-on collision in 1985 after an extraordinary 4-year career as a public representative in the Cape Provincial Council of old. Well, Molly's story has not yet been told, and it's hoped to come out by hopefully towards September, but I can't wait for the book to be published to reflect on an episode in her life towards the end of her life which has just got me so fascinated, and I think there's a story for us to all learn from right now. I've been conducting interviews with all sorts of people that knew Molly, who knew about the situation at the time, Di Bishop, her sister Judy Chalmers, her children. But the person I've been wanting to interview never knew Molly herself, but he knew one of her adversaries. His name is Lt John William Fouche, and the person who encountered him is none other than our famous Traitor's Heart author, Rian Malan. And the story of how it came to be is that I was interviewing Wim Trengrove, who knew Molly and stayed in her home, and he was telling me about his experience as being one of the advocates hired by the families of victims of the Langa massacre that happened in Sharpeville Day on the 21st of March in 1985. And he had said that he had heard that Rian Malan had written something about Lieutenant Fouche, whom he had cross-examined. And I'll tell you what Lieutenant Fouche's role was in the whole story in a moment. So that's the context. And I then found my Traitor's Heart and found Rian, and I said, come, you really is just what I've been looking for, to try and get a better depth perspective on what was going in the mind of Lieutenant Fouche when on the 21st of March he gave the order to open fire, killing 20 people and wounding another 29 others. What I'm going to do is actually just read from the book, and some big reveal that I'm going to leave with Rian, and ask him to read the excerpt from his book, and then we will just talk about it and see how the conversation emerges. Well, this is from one of the main chapters in the book. It's titled Black Weekend, the Black Sash, Smoke, Fire, and the Boy on the Bicycle. Molly's intervention before and after the Langa massacre. Liberty Leading the People is a classic work by the famous French painter Eugène Delacroix. It hangs in the Louvre in Paris as a masterpiece of French Romanticism and an enduring symbol of revolutionary France, according to Wikipedia. The Paris Museum Tour blog tells us Liberty Leading the People helped establish a new kind of painting, and it established a new kind of visual language that would influence generations of artists. It presents liberty as both an allegorical goddess figure and a robust woman of the people. Wikipedia explains the symbolism. The mound of corpses and wreckage acts as a kind of pedestal from which liberty strides, barefoot and bare-breasted, out of the canvas into the space of the viewer.
I know it very well, yes. I didn't know that she had bare feet as well. Oh, she does, yes.
Okay, you know it. Well, Delacroix's famous work of revolutionary fervour leapt out into the space of my mind with a loud clang of synchronicity, because it offered a clue to finally explaining a bizarre delusional narrative about the circumstances of what is known as the Uitenhage Langa Maduna Road massacre that occurred on the 21st of March 1985, a few days after the ominously termed Black Weekend. The Black Weekend, we understand from Professor Mark Swilling, who wrote his PhD thesis on the tragedy, explains it. He says, in response to dynamics that originated in UDF organizations in Port Elizabeth, a call was issued for a 3-day stay away and consumer boycott starting Saturday the 16th of March. The issues around which these mass actions were organized were recession-induced retrenchments, the merger between Amcar and Ford Motor Company that was going to result in more retrenchments, and the petrol price increases. At least 2 and up to 6 people were killed in clashes with the now heavily armed police patrols. It was these victims that were eventually to be buried on the 21st of March, the 25th anniversary of Sharpeville Day. Now, the Sharpeville Massacre is now commemorated in a national public holiday in South Africa as Human Rights Day on the 21st of March. And in 1960, 69 people were killed and 180 people seriously wounded by police who opened fire on a crowd protesting against the pass law. On Sharpeville Day in 1985, the body count of excessive overreaction by apartheid police against oppressed black township residents was increased by 20 more killed and 27 more wounded when black and coloured residents were shot by a detail of 14 riot police armed with lethal weapons and live ammunition. The residents had gathered in numbers with the intent of processing to Kwanabuhle township on the other side of the white town of Uitenhage for a mass funeral of 4 residents of their community who had been killed in the previous week. Swilling explains how Lt Fouche found himself thrust into the pages of history and dubbed as the Butcher of Langa. Quote, Lieutenant Fouche reported for duty at Uitenhage's temporary base at 5:45 a.m. He was aware it was Sharpeville Day, but never discussed this with his men. Despite this, he never expected more trouble than the usual unrest conditions of recent times. Although he was a station commander in Kirkwood, this tough, hard policeman was brought over to Uitenhage to take command of an anti-riot detail on the 15th of March. On that day, he found the body of a policeman in a township street who had been killed by crowds and retaliated by condoning the vicious beating of young black men in the local police station. He was aged 43, had served in the police force since 1961 in various small Eastern Cape towns, and had received medals for bravery, merit, loyalty, and one for outstanding service during his stints on the border. The context of being Sharpeville Day was significant enough, but the more immediate context of the vicious beating referred to above adds a bizarre twist. Molly, Di, and the Black Sash were in the thick of it. The Sash sisters had gathered for their annual national conference in Port Elizabeth, which happened to coincide with the Black Weekend. Mary Burton, a former president, regards it as a turning point for the organization.
Port Elizabeth was particularly feeling the crunch of repression, as the Eastern Cape always has done. And we had our conference there that year. And we had all the normal conference business, but the conference was disrupted on several occasions for dramatic events happening around us. We had, as a guest speaker, a man called Matthew Goniwe, who was on very good terms with a number of the Port Elizabeth Black Sash members there, and who was a teacher in Cradock. And he was a very inspiring teacher. He was a leading member of the United Democratic Front. He was very highly political. And he had a whole group of young students who revered him enormously and whom he had helped to build into the Cradock Youth Association. And he had established other community-based organizations in Cradock. He was such a force in that area that the Department of Education had planned to transfer him out of that region into another school. And there were immediately riots in Cradock and resistance to his being moved, so strong that eventually the government backed down. Anyway, here was this very fine, young, personable teacher. And he came to give a speech at our conference. He was a huge inspiration. A number of us were murmuring to ourselves, there is our next Minister of Education, we hope. He was a fantastic man. A few months later, he and 3 others were assassinated by the security police. And that is a whole other story, long told in the Truth Commission and in many other ways. It is an amazing story. But the loss to the country, apart from anything else. And the huge, for us as the Black Sash, I think it took us a step forward in our understanding of what was really happening in the country. The other thing that happened during that conference was that people from a nearby, smaller town called, well, it's pronounced Uitenhage or Uitenhage, but anyway, it's near Port Elizabeth. And again, parents came to say, we believe that our children are being held in the police cells and we can't get any answers. And so once again, a delegation was sent from the conference to go and try and find out. And the leader of that delegation was Molly Blackburn, who was a significant force in the Black Sash.
Well, this is what Molly had to say about it herself after she was interviewed by Julie Fredericks a few months afterwards.
What actually happened was we were having our SASH conference and I got a telephone call from the chairman of the parents committee, and he just said to me, "Molly, please come quickly, they're killing our children." Well, I didn't know what to expect, so I said to the girls I was going to leave the conference and go out, and did any of them want to come? And they were because they were terribly worried their children had been taken that morning by the police, and they felt concerned. They didn't know where their kids were, and when we got there we found a little cluster of distracted parents standing at the place where we had arranged to meet them, which was outside the post office, and they said, "The police are denying that the knowledge of the whereabouts of our children. We want to know where our children are and why they're being held." And it transpired that I think there were 4 lots of parents there who wanted to know. So we went into the CID office and we said to the man, Lieutenant Nil he was, "Please, these parents are worried, can they see their children?" He said, "Yes, by all means. Just go along the road and up to the charge office, and you'll go to the prison cells and you'll find the person in charge." Well, I don't think he anticipated, and we certainly didn't anticipate what those instructions would lead to, because in fact we took a wrong turning and we came to what we thought were the doors leading to the prison offices. I knocked at the door and walked in through a double door, and there were several policemen in plain clothes there, and there was this dreadful sight of this young man, who we discovered later to be 18 years of age, lying on the floor. I actually saw the policeman whipping him with a great long orange whip. There was no sound coming from the young man. His hands were handcuffed behind his back to the leg of a table. One shoe was off, and he had this blood coming out of his mouth and these open wounds on the side of his head. I shouted at the man to stop, and the others followed in soon after me, and then we said we were not going to move until the station commander was brought. And then there was a really strong battle of wits, because the station commander was not going to come down to oblige us, and we were not going to move until we could see this man freed. So after about 20 minutes of much arguing and shouting, the lieutenant went off and then came back with the man with the keys to the handcuffs, and they resolved the problem by releasing Norman Kona and marching him off to the prison cells. I might say that during this time that we observed this, as we walked in, one of the people, I presume he was a policeman, behind a desk was eating his lunch, and he went on eating his lunch right throughout the whole proceedings, which made me think that he must be fairly used to that sort of scene. On a bench at the side of the office there were 3 young men sitting who looked to be about 18 years of age, with very obvious scars on their faces, or I should say wounds rather than scars, because they were fresh. One of our SASH people talked to them, and it transpired that they had also
happened to see it.
Yeah, you know, this young man, Norman Kona, was taken that morning when he went into the police station to sign the bail register, because a number of them had been taken previously and had been for public violence and had been allowed out on bail. And what happened was, when they went to sign the bail register that morning, they were actually being whipped. When we got the affidavit from Norman Kona a few days later, we said, "What were they asking you?" And he said, "They never asked me anything. They just beat me." So it's not clear what they thought they were doing. I know that 2 days previously a black policeman was murdered in the township, and I think that any young black man in the eyes of the police qualified as a suspect following that. One of the young blacks said to me once upon a time, when I said to them, why do they do this? And he said, I think the police are lazy. He said, I really don't think that they can go through the tedious business of doing a proper interrogation, and that they beat us like this, thinking that we will confess quickly, and then they've got it all sewn up. They don't have to question us for any length of time. But the interesting thing of this particular case was that when they took Norman, and we followed him right to the police cells, and we saw him go in the big doors, and they clanged shut behind him, we then went up to the station commander, Colonel Pretorius, and we described what we had seen. We actually had to wait for about 20 minutes for him to arrive, and he then immediately phoned down to downstairs to ask what was happening, and he made 2 or 3 phone calls, and he said, I don't know what to say to you ladies, but there's nobody of that name here. And he said, there's just no way that I can find somebody who is not here. So I persuaded him, with one of our members who is a doctor, to come with me downstairs. And we went down to the prison cell, and we went in through the doors which clanged, and into an office at the side. And the man in charge said, well, you may by all means go through our register. Firstly, he said, let me tell you that nobody is allowed into the cells unless their name is in the register. And secondly, I don't think you're going to find that man here, because he hasn't been here. So we did. We went through the register, and there was absolutely no evidence that nobody of that name registered in the book. And they always had the time when they were admitted, 202 or 204, and we could very clearly see that nobody had been admitted at the time we said. So I was very confused, and I said to the colonel, look, I really think, I'd like you to come with me to the office where we saw him being assaulted. And we went in, and everything was in perfect order, not a pencil, not a piece of paper out of place. And then we looked down on the floor, and I said, there's the blood on the floor still. So that was at least a slight proof that we had seen something. He said to us, well, let's go through to the CID and ask them. They greeted us with blank stares and said that the only thing they could imagine would be that he might be out in a police van which didn't have a radio, and therefore there was no way of them contacting the police. So we said, look, we'll give you 3/4 of an hour and we'll come back, and we want that chap right here. We got back after 3/4 of an hour. Now they were openly laughing at us, and they just said there's absolutely nobody of that name around at all. So we were very distressed. We left not knowing what to do. I got in touch with the chairman of the parents committee the next morning, and he said, oh, by the way, Norman Kona was released at 11:30 last night. When we took the affidavit and we measured up the time factors, we discovered that in the first place he had never left the building. He was there the whole time we were there. And in the second place, they had pushed him into a tiny little back room, which was no more than 20 meters from where we were standing. They knew, I would like to think they knew very well where he was. But really, when you see somebody disappearing before your very eyes in such a bland way, you begin to understand the worrying aspect of black leaders. I mean, we've had our PEPCO leaders here who have just disappeared off the face of the earth, now actually arrested. But the point that I was trying to make, that story actually hit the headlines, because Sash gave a very, very clear statement to the press of exactly what we had seen. Now, as I am given feedback, second-hand feedback, because I don't think people would actually dare say such a thing to me, but people said, oh, he must have deserved it. And this is the nub of it here, that people don't really know the duties of the policemen. They are starting to accept outrageous behaviour, which is really becoming the norm, because very often it goes unchallenged. In this particular case, there will be a case against the police, but we are seeing it time and time again with the funerals, when funerals are now becoming very political because people can't have meetings. If there's a victim of unrest, then the orations at the funeral service and the events at the wake after the funeral have strong political overtones, and invariably it has resulted in the police intervening, and then there have been more deaths, more vigils, more funerals, more intervention by the police, and it's developed into a
Two police officers responsible for the torture were duly convicted and fined. However, there was another clash of narratives that made the 17th of March visit to Uitenhage police station still more significant, which was to earn Lieutenant Fouche another dishonourable moniker, Dry Bry. Di explains, when we returned to the charge office to look for the station commander, another ranking police officer, Lieutenant Fouche, had just come on duty. He had placed his R1 rifle on the desk behind the counter, pointing towards anyone who might enter. He was loud, aggressive and uncooperative. He came around the counter and in the process dropped a magazine of bullets which scattered over the floor. I smelled liquor on his breath and whispered to Molly that I thought he had been drinking. Molly, being Molly, then reported this to the station commander when he finally arrived. He evidently confronted Lieutenant Fouche in his office, who then stormed towards us shouting, "Which one of you women accused me of being drunk?" Molly said, "It was me, and you do not need to shout, I'm standing right next to you." He threatened to charge us for falsely accusing him. Mary Burton recalls that it was a very big press story on their hands. Now, whether or not Lieutenant Fouche had any drinks after the tumultuous day will never be known, but Molly, Di and her Black Sash sisters got back to Port Elizabeth and certainly did. But whatever bad press came his way for his unprofessional conduct on Sunday, this paled into insignificance by his conduct on Thursday. And then Swilling sets the scene. Thursday, 21st of March, 1985. It was quiet, hot and cloudless, the start of a typical March day for the Eastern Cape. Most people in Uitenhage's white suburbs were still asleep as a few dozen riot policemen reported for duty at their Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage bases shortly before 6 a.m. Many white workers were sleeping late because the giant VW factory was closed for the day. Adhering to the stay-away call, very few residents were planning to go to work in the black townships. The absence of the usual bustle of early morning cars, pedestrians and pirate taxis left what one policeman on patrol later described as a deathly quiet. There were some who tried to walk to work at about 6 a.m, but as they were turned back by small groups of residents, no one anticipated the tragic violence that was soon to claim the lives of 43 people, nor were the people of Langa to know that their poor dusty township would, by the end of the day, become a name synonymous of the worst of apartheid in the eyes of the world. Now let us introduce Kwanabuhle Moses Bukwa. He was then a 17-year-old. He had lived in a shack at 6 Stofile Road with his two sisters and a brother. He had a standard 3 education and worked at a local poultry farm, a job he got in January 1985. He had left school in 1983 because his mother could no longer afford to pay his fees. "She is poor," he said. The farm paid him 19 rands 50 per week, part of which he had used to buy a BMX bicycle from his brother. When Moses returned from work on the 20th of March, he learned that a stay-away had been called for the next day. However, he was unaware of the significance of the day. If he had known what had happened 25 years before, and that a funeral of previous victims of police action was planned for that day, perhaps he would have acted differently. He was also unaware of any announcements that evening cancelling or banning funerals. Nevertheless, Moses decided his job at the poultry farm was too valuable to risk for the sake of a funeral or a stay-away. He normally left for work at 6 a.m. However, on the morning of the 21st, he knew no one was going to work. He eventually got on his bicycle and left for work at 9:15 a.m. and he took his normal route from Sharpeville Road down 16th Avenue and then left into Kwanabuhle Road. Moses never forgot the scene that confronted him as he turned into Kwanabuhle Road that morning. On his right was a very large crowd singing in Nkosi Sikelele iAfrika, and on his left, about 25 meters from the crowd, were two Caspers parked in a V formation across the road just below 15th Avenue. He tried to get past on the right side of the Caspers, but before proceeding between the Caspers, he turned towards the crowd, and in order to dispel any suspicions about his true destination, he gave a clenched fist salute. As he did so, Lt Fouche discharged a shot from his pistol, and Moses fell to the ground, blood streaming from the left side of his head. The strikebreaker became the first target. There was immediately a commission appointed, known as the Kanamea Commission, and it got to work pretty quickly to return to that liberty leading the people's painting. Had Eugene Delacroix been in the public gallery of the Uitenhage Magistrates Court when Judge Kanamea sat to hear testimony as chair, he would surely have gasped when Lt Fouche, apparently nicknamed by his friends as Smoke, tried to explain why he had shouted fire. The testimony that he gave to try and justify why he had given an order on his men to open fire with lethal ammunition on a defenseless crowd left us flabbergasted. The lawyer representing the victims of the families, Advocate Wim Trengroves, cross-questioned him to try and fathom how well-armoured riot police with lethal firepower had felt justified in shooting people armed only with stones. Trengrove: now can we please understand a little about the stone-throwing attack? In the first place, was the leader leading an attack whilst your men were shooting on the crowd? Is that correct? Fouche: stones were being thrown before we started shooting. Trengrove: Lieutenant, let's forget about the 1 or 2 stones that the coloured woman threw, shall we? Okay. We are talking of a stone attack, correct? Fouche: yes. That stone-throwing attack was led whilst the crowds were under fire from 15 men in a Casper, correct? Out of 2 Caspers. Out of 2 Caspers, correct? That's right. There was one short volley, victims fell. But at the same time, the crowd keeps advancing with its stone attack. Is that your testimony? That is my testimony. In other words, whilst the stone attack was truly underway, you stopped firing. Your Honour, the stone attack came during the shooting. Lieutenant, there were people shot who had already fallen. Others were behind them. Are you saying they continued to storm ahead over the fallen victims and they shelled you with stones? That is correct. That is what occurred. Well, Judge Kanamea ultimately found Lt Fouche to be an unreliable witness who was simply trying to justify his gross overuse of lethal force. He found his testimony of a bare-breasted coloured woman sufficiently bizarre to be believable. A year later, Rian Malan was travelling in the area and paid a visit to Lt Fouche. Rian, let's bring you into this conversation. I want you to just read from your book.
So I checked into Kirkwood's early hotel and went for a walk in the twilight. The wind was blowing dust around, the streets were silent save for the scurrying of newspaper scraps and the creak of shop signs in the wind. One of those signs read Salters and rang some sort of bell. Jack Salters was Kirkwood's alone, just white man, a British immigrant who married a coloured woman. After that, many whites refused to set foot in his general store, claiming it to be permeated by a fail hotnotstunk, the foul reek of Hottentot. They turned their backs on the Salters in the streets and hung up closed signs when he tried to enter their shops. Then the town elders withdrew his business license. Now Jack Salters was gone, driven back to England, and the main street deserted save for me and a small mongoloid boy in a grown man's body. As we talked, I noticed a moustached white man in a white safari suit watching us from across the street. When I walked on, the safari suit exchanged a few words with the idiot. I rounded a corner and the safari suit came after me. I circled the block and found the idiot still standing on the same corner, still gaping into the wind. "Who is that man?" I asked him. "That uncle is the police." Made sense. In the prevailing climate of paranoia, I was a suspect figure. My hair was too long, my clothes were outlandish, and I was driving a car with Johannesburg plates. I decided to play a joke on my tail. I walked on until I saw the blue light of the police station, and then I walked right into the commander's office, flashing my press credentials, and introduced myself. The commander was a slight grey man, spick and span and his regulation blues. He had a kindly, rumpled face, indecisive blue eyes, and a golden cocker spaniel at his feet. The wall behind him was lined with plaques for border service, and the name on them rang another bell, Lt John William Fouche. It slowly dawned on me that I was face to face with the notorious butcher of Langa, the officer who ordered the police to open fire on an unarmed black crowd several months earlier in an incident that became known as the Langa Massacre. 19 blacks had died, or 23 or 27, depending on who was counting. In the judicial inquiry that followed, there was evidence that some of Fouche's men had taunted the crowd, dared the blacks to throw stones, and then mowed them down once they did. Fouche must have recognized the look on my face, because he started telling me he wasn't really the bad man the press had made him out to be. He spun his chair and drew my attention to a bravery citation on the wall behind him. He won it for rescuing 104 blacks from the flooded Kwanabuhle River, and now they were saying that he was a racist butcher. He insisted it was not true. I believe in change, he said. Ons kan nie met 'n ossewa en perd voortgaan nie. We can't go on as we are in ox wagon and on horseback. Things must change. I don't mind if a black comes to live next door to me. He must just behave himself. Taken aback by Fouche's pathetic defense of unspoken charges, I asked him for his side of the story. He started talking about something terrible he'd seen in that very township, something that had shattered his nerve. At one point, he said, he and his detachment had been dispatched to rescue one of Langa's black collaborators from a riotous mob. They were too late. By the time they arrived on the scene, the collaborator's house was burning and his entire family was dead. One son shot by his own father to save him from being burned alive. In the aftermath, Fouche told me, he saw a man carve a slice of one of the charred bodies and eat it. I shook my head in disbelief, but Fouche gave me his word. I checked it out later, and it seemed to be true in all respects save one. It happened in the explosion of rage that followed the Langa massacre, not before it. Still, I seem to have returned to a country in which anything could be true, even the most far-fetched horror. It's easy to talk if you weren't there, Fouche continued. They wanted to march through the white part of town. My orders were to turn them back, but they wouldn't listen, so what was I supposed to do? What would you have done? The subject clearly pained him, so I changed it. How's the security situation now? I asked. It was quiet these days, he said, quieter than before. A few months earlier, Kirkwood had been the site of an uprising, just one among thousands, barely reported in the press. The blacks burnt down the township's hated Bantu administration office, along with a few buses and the homes of 5 black policemen. Police subdued them with tear gas and birdshot, and scores of protesters were injured. A week or two later, an old Boer in an isolated farmhouse woke up to find a horde of Mandela comrades battering his kitchen door with axes. He fired through the door until he ran out of ammunition. Then the blacks broke in, and that was the end of the Boer and his wife. In the months since, all the whites whose farms abutted Kirkwood's black township had been driven off their land by arson and rustling. Once frontier, still frontier. On the night before the rebellion started, a handwritten manifesto was nailed to the door of Kirkwood's Bantu administration office. This is what it said. Children of Africa, let us fight for our lives. We have lost our soldiers of Africa, and they were killed by white pigs, Hollanders, sea dwellers, etc. Shoot us like birds because we have no weapons. These suckers of our blood, I mean white pigs, Boers, white dogs. Why does not emancipate our black nation from under this oppression? They must pack their bags and go to Holland, their motherland. We are uprising against government. May God bless you. By comrades, soldiers of Africa.
Well, the reason Lieutenant Fouche described as an adversary of Molly is that he made good his threat to actually sue them, and she was then sued with criminal defamation by him after the Kwanabuhle Commission report, and she appeared in court, and in this bizarre situation where she had to appear in one court to go and testify against the 2 police officers that were eventually convicted of having basically been torturing that one, and then had to go and be a defendant in another court for being charged with crime and injuria or criminal defamation. Fortunately, that charge has now been scrapped off our books, but it's one in which the police were fond of using because it meant the state had to then bring the charge because it's a criminal matter.
Is this because she'd accused him of murder on the day of the massacre, or because she'd said he was drunk on duty?
No, just because she had said he was drunk on duty. Oh. So the way that then played out is that she was acquitted, because the magistrate sliced things cleverly enough to be able to at least spare Lieutenant Fouche his job, because he said his appearance and his behaviour was very aggressive and loud, and even though one of his friends had testified to the fact that this is his normal behaviour. He was that sort of person, aggressive, loud, and all the rest. Now, you met him. Did he come across to you as aggressive, loud, and somewhat uncouth?
That's all in my dim recollection of that afternoon. As I walked in, he seemed slightly pathetic. He had, I guess he was then about 44 years old. He had a sort of slightly seedy look about him, and I've got to say, Molly's defence, he did look like a guy who drank quite a lot. He just had that look, a puzza face, as we say in South Africa. And he was sitting there with a cocker spaniel at all his plaques and his heroic rescue of black people from a flooded river. And he seemed to me actually struck me as a sort of gentle and sort of this guy. And he probably assumed that because I was a journalist that I'd walked in to talk to him about his reputation as the butcher of Langa and all the people that his men had killed that day. And it wasn't the case at all. It was a complete accident. So as I observed, he launches into this defensive, slightly pathetic defensive charge that I hadn't even brought against him. And it seemed to me that is the act of a guy's conscience is I think it might be an act of a guy's conscience is aware in him. He seemed quite eager to justify himself. And there's something sort of pathetic about his plight. What did you have done in my situation? They told me I had to stop this crowd. I did. What did you expect me to do?
Well, he was exonerated in a sense that they said, well, the blameworthiness in respect of that matter lay with the fact that they were not issued with any proper riot gear and deterrence means of, tear gas. They were given lethal ammunition. Kwanabuhle was a Liberal judge, and he was somebody who people thought would come up a bit more convincingly to actually hold the feet to the fire of the police. But he got off, and that's why you were able to meet him. But in a sense, I mean, this is a paradoxical thing. In a sense, had he been charged, had he gone through the court system, one would hope that at least there could have been some levelling and reckoning. But the very fact that he was exonerated has meant that he was actually wandering with a, unresolved issue, without closure, and therefore was looking for an opportunity to try and justify, and you gave him that opportunity.
Sure, but it's also, I just gave him the benefit of the doubt, and maybe he didn't quite deserve it, because the one thing that he did pull in our chat there is he starts telling me about the stress he'd been under. I guess that was the implication, and terrible things that he'd seen on the battle line. And this incident where he was called to the house of a presumed collaborator who'd been attacked by a mob of comrades, and the house was on fire, etc. And he claims in the aftermath he saw somebody cut a slice off one of the charred bodies of the dead and eat it. I'm quite surprised to hear myself saying there, this is incredibly far-fetched. It turned out to be true. But as I dimly recall, that had been reported in one of the local newspapers, and this being South Africa, I'm not quite 100% sure it is true, although South Africa is a country where the truth is very often stranger than fiction, and such things have happened previously and still do. But this thing is that he was giving to believe that's why he issued this order to pull the trigger, and he was bullshitting, because that happened after, it happened in response to his men shooting down all these basically unarmed, defenseless people in cold blood. So he was making if he tried that in front of a judge, William Trengrove, he would have come seriously short, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Well, now what do you make of the fact that, as I show you the description of liberty leading the people? Now, I don't know, did he ever tell you that he had been to the Louvre and seen that painting? Because I found it extraordinarily bizarre that the scenario that he tried and depicts to justify himself, which of course Wim Trengrove saw straight through, was in fact the story that Delacroix was trying to paint. I mean, does that not kind of make you amazed?
I wonder if Lieutenant Fouche was the sort of guy coming where he did from. The police in South Africa in the apartheid era, they were mostly working class lads, and I think you were required to get him to finish school. But he wasn't. Would he have? I suppose Delacroix is that image is so deeply embedded in the human consciousness that maybe he did know it. But what is this judge's remark there? It says that this was such a bizarre, truth being stranger than fiction and so forth. The judge accepted this could reasonably be true. A drunk coloured woman with bare breasts throwing. But I've got to say,
I wonder if the judge was aware of Delacroix's thing, and that's why I kind of, in my own imagination, just imagine Delacroix sitting in the gallery thing saying, my gosh, you know, I thought I was describing something that happened in 1820, you know, not something that happened in South Africa in 1985.
But you see, that's not particularly a South African thing. It's the bare breast things. It's, you know, we have had incidents over the last 20, 30 years when people get very angry of African women bearing their buttocks to the police and other authority figures, which is a serious gesture of contempt. I mean, I've never seen a photograph or in our long history of political violence. That's the first time such a thing has come up.
Now, I mean, I'm a writer, but I'm actually a social worker, and the first duty of a social worker is to not be judgmental and not to judge, to exercise that impartiality of actually not rushing to judgment. And from that point of view, I've actually tried to get to know, and this is why I found you, is because I was trying to get to the humanity behind this man. Because if history is going to help us, what lessons can we distill from this? And the one which for me is significant, having now found myself getting more and more into the writing of René Girard, and his work on mimetic rivalry and how human beings learn by imitation, not by some innate biological thing, and that there's this process of mimetic rivalry that actually develops and escalates into conflict. And as I'm looking through that lens at what was happening there, the rivalry between AZAPA and UDF was escalating. People blamed the police for stirring it up. But as we're now reading René Girard's thing, what happens is what he called an scapegoating mechanism, where you try and find somebody in your out-group who you blame for all the ills in your in-group, and then they get ejected and all the rest. And I wonder to what extent poor old Lieutenant Fouche was being scapegoated as a convenient sort of epitome of a crooked or evil cop. And I don't believe he was that.
Well, can I say this in his defense? This is because my name is Malan, so I'm an Afrikaner of some sort or other. And Afrikaners, especially of my father, the generations before me, but to a certain extent my generation as well, there was this huge pressure to be toxically male, as we'd say today, to be kragtadig, which means that you had the strength of deeds and you had a character, that you had to be the boss and you had to be authoritarian. And the guy that I met that day, he struck me as a sort of like an adequate and maybe sweet guy. Maybe he drank too much, but Afrikaans, like my father, was a very thoughtful, sort of like well-educated sort of guy. But he had that at times as well. It was just this mode that Afrikaans males would slip into. And I had the impression, reading this again and just going back to that he's the sort of guy who would have felt compelled to put on this demonstration of when Molly accused him of being drunk on duty. I'm willing to believe that he was drunk on duty, even though I have no cause to say. But I can also see him feeling, oh God, now I've got to react to this, and I've got to show that I'm a real man, and this woman can't push me around, and I'm going to walk, and then I'm going to zap my pound of flesh. And
which I see happening today. I mean, as you know, I work now counselling whistleblowers, and these are the people that are speaking truth to power, which is what Molly was doing. And it seems to me that the real truth about power is that it has to find somebody to scapegoat and retaliate against, because power is essentially corrupting of its own narrative. And I talked about this being a clash of narratives. So, and that's why I'm hoping that this lesson we can extract from this is saying what's happening in South Africa today. Because it's a similar dynamic. I mean, we've got police officers, I shall not name their names, who have been basically retaliating against me and against some of my clients for precisely calling them out for the sort of atrocities that happened in the Langa Massacre of 1985.
you mean they're calling you?
Yes.
They're coming after you?
Yes. In social media, sort of like, disparaging me and calling me a charlatan and all the rest. They're using social media now, which of course Lieutenant Fouche didn't have it back then. We didn't have media, but I can still see that the same dynamic is at play. The paradox of it is that I can, in a sense, shrug it off, because knowing Molly's story and seeing what she went through, I can see that, well, this is what happens to you if you're going to take on an unjust regime, if you're going to call out those who actually feather their own nests and carry on in the way they did. So there's nothing new about that. It's just that their methods and tactics have changed.
You know, speaking of René Girard, I once read a book of his called Violence and the Sacred.
Yes.
And that was, you know, it was as I recall, it's one of its central themes was the use of the ancient Romans and Greeks of animal sacrifice for religious purposes. And in the sort of whitest heat of South African struggle, where you had got a lot of innocent people being killed, often for reasons that seemed entirely symbolic. You know, some necklace victims. It seemed to me that we were looking at a similar. Exactly how you tie that into whistleblowing. I mean, can I say something about whistleblowers?
Yes,
like you
sure.
and others there? You know, I'm semi-retired, and I'm what is not good, drunk on pessimism and despair. But I mean, I got huge admiration for, especially all the people, the African civil servants who came out of the woodwork in the Zondo Commission, and really risked their lives by telling the most shocking stories entirely out of things. It was a terribly brave thing to do, and I just feel that, you know, we haven't, as a society, the sacrifice seems to have been in vain.
In fact, well, Rian, interestingly, I mean, the other thing I've discovered in the course of the research, the first necklacing in South Africa happened in Uitenhage as well, where the councillor Kini was actually taken out, and his whole family, and that story that the story describes, which, and I mean, it is bizarre that he should now reverse the timelines so as to actually give some justification for what he did. But more important for me is the fact that what was happening in this process of necklacing as a scapegoating mechanism, and a belief that somehow if we kill these people it's going to do it. And Molly stood, and Desmond Tutu and people, Black Sash, found themselves caught up in the midst of this conflict and thought, how could they find a way of defusing it? And now Tutu famously found himself in many instances where he had to deal with that.
One of the reasons why, speaking of that, in Easter 1986, there was a terrible outbreak of violence in Sekhukhune where comrades wearing UDF t-shirts had become quite convinced that elders, and especially old, defenseless widows in their village were using witchcraft to retard the struggle for freedom. And there was a sort of mass necklacing event there which claimed 30 lives there. And that there was once again is this thing about that is a sort of an event that accords much more closely with Girard's theory of violence and the sacred, because you had this intermingling of religion, superstition, and so forth, and these people were clearly
exactly, you know,
It was also this amazing, this very interesting mix of modernity and an ancient and sometimes forgotten Africa, the beliefs that.
Well, there is up on my YouTube channel, for those who are interested, a whole discussion on René Girard's comfort to whistleblowers and how I've used it, because many of my whistleblowers, at least they can understand what's happening to them and not take it too personally. They can see this as a dynamic. And then what's really interesting with René Girard himself eventually came all the way back, having left the church and become disillusioned with religion and all the rest, eventually found that that within good old-fashioned Catholic teaching there was a way of understanding, and he saw Jesus as having basically become the scapegoat, which deconstructed that whole process of scapegoating and forgave his enemies. And that, in a sense, is the ethic which then infused the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But it's something which each generation has to learn for itself. So you say you're feeling somewhat pessimistic about where South Africa is too. I must say so am I. Because I've seen that what one mechanism for dealing with this mimetic conflict are the courts of law. And we're seeing such an undermining of our judicial system and the criminal justice system that you're getting people who are not actually facing the truth of their reality, starting from our former state president downwards. But what he does say is that there needs to be alternative mechanisms need to evolve to deal and defuse with that mimetic conflict. Otherwise, it will escalate and escalate into an Armageddon type situation.
But you know, I mean, the this is the goddess of justice with the blindfolded lady holding aloft the scales there. Oh, so she's very wounded in South Africa now, but I mean, it's still amazing me that she still stands. It's like it's still fairly difficult in South Africa. Can you think of a politician who's openly defied a court order? I mean, Zuma with his Stalingrad defense, well, it's been more than 20 years now since he was first charged with to court to answer for alleged acts of corruption. But he never openly defied. You know, his lawyers were always in court, like sort of trying this and trying that, this delaying tactic, appeal this thing, appeal to a higher court, and that's been going on since.
It has, but what concerns me, I mean, I've been the target of a defamation slap suit as well, and that's now settled. We've actually got a constitutional court judgment, which has basically found that it's an abuse and an improper use of the law to actually, with the vexatious intention often, to actually use these sort of, in this very sort of unequal, conflict that exists between the wealthy people and that it's been outlawed.
And to cut your tongue out there.
Yeah, that's right. It's effectively this, but of course it hasn't worked, and it's actually. But they're still going on. I mean, I have clients right now. Actually, I'm talking to their adversaries and say, guys, and talking to their lawyers and saying, for goodness sake, don't do it. The point is, however, is that on the 21st of March in 2024, Sharpeville Day, I will be on the Wild Coast at a commemoration of the murder of Bazooka Khadebe, who was killed 8 years ago, still no prosecution. Wow. And the point I want your comment on, because the criminal justice system had failed. I spoke to Frank Dutton, who had been the former head of the Scorpions, and I said, what can we do after this, a month after it happened? He said, John, don't trust the criminal justice system. Use civil litigation. So where we are seeing justice is through civil litigation. Through us actually having to make the going. The National Prosecuting Authority that should be driving criminal justice system. I mean, we're having the Senzo trial at the moment. And I'm quite well networked within people who are observing that one. And I just despair because it leaves me in a position as a social worker. We're not supposed to judge. But in the absence of a rigorous process of assessing whose version of the truth is the right one.
That Senzo creates is like, I mean, this is like if the storied and glorious captain of the South African soccer team in the soccer mad nation dies under those circumstances, and here we are 10 years after his death and the matter remains unresolved, what chance have ordinary people?
Exactly. And I mean, but Oscar Pistorius' case, a white privileged white male, that problem, he's now about to go on parole. I mean, he's out now. We're still waiting for justice in this thing. So of course you can understand why people get very critical that it's still privilege that actually gets you justice in this country. That those who are poor, marginalized and underprivileged are basically just don't have anything going for them. So will then tend to resort to basically vigilantism and other sorts of means to kind of get some justice. So that's what does make me pissed. So cheer me up. Tell me give me some hope, Rian.
Give me some hope.
From your long experience, because you've been through this whole process.
For your particular case, I can't say. I mean, South Africa, I get up in the morning and I smoke cigarettes and drink 6 cups of coffee, and then I read the morning news, and if by 10 o'clock I'm so toxic that if I was a pig and you killed me and ate me, I'd kill you. I'd poison you. But I think that for me the big question in South Africa is, it's a twofold question. How much whites like me have been in Africa genetically since 1688? For that's 9 generations now. What I've learnt about Africa and how much of Africa has rubbed off on me and got into my blood and my mind. And the converse is like how much of us has rubbed off on them. I think it's going to be the factor that determines our case, because even in my darkest days of despair, it's like I drive around in the country, or even in the middle of nowhere, and I drive around my old bakkie on rough roads, and then I listen to SAFM, And the last several years, it's like more and more is like callers into SAFM, guys who discussing current affairs. They all sound more or less like me. It's like they're madder than hell. They've had enough. They don't want to change. And I think my heart swells. I think I love these people. I love this country, and all hope is not gone. They,
yeah, and also, I mean, the fact that the fact that your mother was from English-speaking stock, your father was from Afrikaans stock. My daughter's just married a Boere seentjie ook, and she got married at Beenkorp, where 123 years ago they were Boers and Brits were killing each other. So in that sense, we've seen that change, and I think it was that Ankie Kroch made the observation during the TRC hearings that part of the problem of apartheid emerging was because of the injustices done and the scapegoating, getting back to the scapegoating, by the British of the Boers. Fortunately, there were British people like Emily Hobhouse and others.
Captain McBride of the Irish.
Yes, and were able to actually say, look, hang on. But she was very concerned that then the feeling that apartheid emerged out of a deep concern amongst the Afrikaners that there's nobody else going to look after them, and they'd look after themselves. And where did the biggest threat come from? Well, they could learn a lot from the British and use some of their education, but that they felt that the black majority had to be kept at bay because that would distinguish them. I mean, did you grow up with that sort of cultural meme?
So there's this thing called trauma studies now, with humiliation studies, and I think that the history of the crushing of the Boer republics and what some Afrikaners regard as the theft of our gold fields, etc., by the rapacious British Empire. I don't think that was, of course, a formative event, but it was what happened thereafter. It's like, the Afrikaners were simple and primitive people. They didn't have much education, and the frontier had closed. Frontier closed around 1880s. Almost all the land in the country had been fenced. And you couldn't do what Afrikaners and nomads had always done, is push off over the next horizon and claim some land for yourself. That had closed off, and so after the Anglo-Boer, they became increasingly urbanized, and increasingly, but there was the poor white problem. And I think that Afrikaners like my father, who was born in 1920 and he went to Stellenbosch in 1939, a good year for fascism, that for him it was that he also grew up pretty much barefooted. And there was this humiliation, because they knew, and they were quite correct, is that the British regarded them as inferior. I can cite you sort of chapter and verse in that, but they did. They were sort of second, they had really no, capitalism in South Africa was a British phenomenon, an English phenomenon. People like my father, it wasn't, my father, and D.F. Malan, my namesake, who was the first apartheid premier. I can't claim to be a great expert of him, but I've read several Afrikaans biographies of him, and also his versamelde toesprake, his collection of speeches, and all the speeches, they were all, his central obsession seemed to be, it wasn't blacks, it was the British, and was achieving economic justice. He had been a socialist in his life in 1911, 1912, or a syndicalist as he called himself then. And the only reason he turned against it is because Marxism was godless, and he believed that it was all in the hands of God. But it was like this sort of, his essential thing is to push the Afrikaners to overcome their humiliation by seizing the state and using the power of the state to draw equal to and show the English that they were just as good as them. And I think that black South Africans were collateral damage of that thing, because I'm not saying that he was the non-racist at all. I'm just saying that he didn't particularly care about blacks. And in 1948, at that time, there was no serious challenge to white power. You'd had, the history preceding South Africa, the various acts. For a guy like my father was a really serious kind of guy. He was a much better human being than me. He was a Christian. He never used the K word. He drank every Friday night. His best friend was a guy called Harry Hendricks, who was a rubrikskraver, an editorial writer for one of the Afrikaans dailies in Johannesburg. And on Friday nights, we'd either go there and braai, or they'd come to us. And then my father and Harry would sit there with, smoking Stuyvesant cigarettes and having one or two brandy and cokes. And the constant lament was how people in the Buitenland and outside world didn't understand the Afrikaners and didn't understand how difficult their situation was in Africa and how do we possibly change that. My father was a nationalist from 1939 until the day the Vrye Weekblad came out with a cover story called Bloedspoor van die SAP, blood trail of the South African police, which is the first revelations about the death squads at Vlakplaas. That story killed him. By the time he died, which is 5 years later, he was more left-wing than me. He said, you know, his line had always been, Afrikaners would never do this. We go to church on Sundays. Probably like Fouche would have said. That, you know, when I was 12, a guy named Ahmed Timel, who'd been trained in the Soviet Union, came back to South Africa and he was picked up by the political police, and then he somehow fell from the 12th floor of police headquarters and of course died. And so there was, I took it upon myself to write this letter, say, as an Afrikaner, I find this reprehensible, I demand a full explanation. And the Star published my letter, the Star being the big daily at the time, and under the headline, "An Afrikaner speaks out." And then I thought, oh shit, how's this going to go down with my old man? So he comes home and he pours himself a whiskey and he opens the newspaper, he gets to the editorial page and he sees this and his only reaction stiffens somewhat, and then he says, looks at me and says, "What gives you the right to call yourself an Afrikaner?" And he was right, you know, he was right. You know, he'd made the mistake of like letting light into my benighted life by subscribing to Time and Life and these American magazines where, you know, you read about, you know, long hairs, people smoking dope, the rock and roll things, and I thought, well, that was really fascinating there.
You weren't a ware Afrikaner, want jy het met 'n Engelse meisiekind getroud. So your mother, what was her influence? How did that happen? How did the romance start?
Oh, right. So my mother, whose maiden name was Gay, she was of Scottish. Her father was a Scotsman. Her mother was from 1820 settler stock, and she was born on a farm in the Eastern Transvaal in 1924. She's still alive today. How about that then? But and they came from, it was a sort of family where they were empire loyalists. My mother was the sort of person who turned out, you know, in the Royal Tour of 1947 to squeal and wave flags, the passing royalty, you know, the king and queen and the princess came to do, and she was, you know, she couldn't speak Afrikaans, not a word of it. She says, you know, she used to walk around behind with her mother in the streets of East London, and there'd be somebody walking ahead with them with a sort of short back and sides and short pants on, and my grandmother would say, "That's a Dutchman, it's one of them." But anyway, so then she goes to Teachers Training College and she gets a qualification. But then at the time, because of the SMAT's the bilingual schools policy, you earned less if you couldn't speak Afrikaans, and she couldn't. She'd failed Afrikaans hopelessly. So she decided she had to go and teach in Afrikaans for school for a year. So she went to Hunklip, which is in Queenstown, which is it was regarded as, you know, it was the Afrikaners were on a drop and the English were people were up here. But anyway, my mother went there and it wasn't quite the done thing. But then she met my father, who was a terribly sweet guy, and he was also quite good looking, and so there was love at first sight. And he invites her out on a date, and her memory of this is that they go to the Bioscope in Queenstown, and before the film starts, they play the British national anthem as they always used to do, and then she said, just a clap 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 as all the Afrikaners stood up and slapped their seats behind and walked out because they refused to sing the British national
homage
anthem
to the Queen.
And my father was one of those, because he'd been in the Ossewa Brandwacht, which is a sort of underground organisation in World War II, training, doing military training on the rugby fields of Stellenbosch in the moonlight. But anyway, so now it's 1944. And things are moving on, and my parents like fall in love, and then there's a consternation on both sides, because newspapers at the time would refer to those as interracial marriages, even though both parties are white. It was still, and so my mother, like her father was dead by then, so but the patriarch of the extended gay Connacht clan came down to see her in the train and said, "My girls just won't do, you know, you're letting the side down here, and just think, where are your children going to fit in?" And my father was kidnapped by the local general of the Ossewa Brandwacht. They sort of grabbed him, it's more or less against his will, and took him off to a farm and spent a weekend trying to indoctrinate him. Look, you've got a future in Afrikaans. Power is within our grasp, and when that happens, you can't be married to one of the enemy. So eventually they broke up. There was such pressure, and my mother started going out with a guy with a handlebar moustache who was like an RAF pilot. and she'd moved to Bloemfontein by then, but then my father heard. My father heard that she was going to get married to this Englishman, and that she was on her way down to East London on a train, and so he rode his bicycle to the station when the train was passing through, and fell to his knees on the platform and said, "Marry me instead," and so she did.
Wow, what a romantic thing.
For me, when I first heard that story, it was much later. My father was the most undemonstrative man. He was kind of sweet, but he was shy. And my mother, my mother was, my mother's. Anyway, but they clearly must have been a great love affair.
There was, and of course it lasted what? When did your father die? How many years? 60 or so years? 70?
He died at the age of 74, 1994, sorry.
Yeah. And your mother, you mentioned 1924, so that's 2024. She's turning 100.
Yeah.
Next week?
Yes.
On what date?
The 19th of March. Yeah.
So a few days before Sharpeville Day, and it's just intriguing to think we're talking about Sharpeville Day from the 1960s. She was already, how old was she then? 40? 24, she was already an adult.
Yeah.
So,
I told my mother I would have been 6 years old at the time of Sharpeville.
Yeah, me too.
I can't, I just remember there was a sense of alarm in the white suburbs that
yeah. Well, and you need to get back to her because you're up here in Parys to actually pray for her birthday, which is a wonderful thing. And I've met your mother, and I must say I feel very proud to actually have had a bit of time with her. So I'm sorry I can't be at the birthday party. Got other things, another Sharpeville Day event to deal with.
But before we I just want to talking about Sharpeville made me think. Something as a journalist that I've always wanted to follow up. We sitting here talking about Afrikaner males and their perceived need to spray toxic bioscup and be in charge and whatever, and how it struck me that Fouche was the sort of guy I'd have to struggle to put on that sort of front. But the other one was the police commander at the police station in Sharpeville, the guy where again he gave the command to open fire on unarmed black protesters, and 69 people died. And then shortly thereafter he committed suicide. And so I was just wondering if this was, again, it's like beneath this sort of brash Boer butch macho exterior, there was actually like sort of a heart.
Well, I mean, and that's bears consideration too. Is that there's the extraordinary story by Sean Johnson about his father. He was in his book in the Native Commissioner.
Yes, yeah.
It's the same story, but this was somebody who acted with integrity and ethical, accountability, and refused to kowtow to that regime, and he also found it just untenable. And I would want to say, it's so sad. I mean, I had a great uncle who was one of Rhodes's magistrates who had fought in the gun war, had been a commander in the Cape Mounted Rifles and all the rest, and he was likewise in this very invidious position of now having to try and implement Rhodes's intentions with the Glen Grey Act and all the rest, and he stood his ground against him and he refused. But he died young. He died at the age of 50. I think the whole pressure of it all, I'm not sure.
Where was the station? Transkei?
In Transkei. He's one of the frontier things. He moved to several different places, and he hosted Rhodes in his home. So that's going to be one of my other episodes when I get to it, about how history helps, because it was so helpful to me to get to know my own family narrative. Going back to him, and found he had at least kept a diary, because he was quite a public figure there, being a magistrate. His brother, my great-grandfather, wasn't. He was a man that left to go and make his fortune in gold in the gold fields. It was even before it was called Johannesburg, and he was hoping that he would really strike it rich. He didn't. He died at the age of 65, whilst in the employ of the Transvaal administration as a night watchman. So it's also been very soulful for me to understand that, and to understand how history what goes before, and for us to own our stories. Because if you own your story, you earn the right to finish it. If you don't, my experience has been, this is what I tell whistleblowers, your adversaries are going to find your areas of shame and use that to manipulate you and shame you and disempower you. So own your story with warts and all. Make it a sort of a transformative thing, because we've all got a story, and that's why I like Rian Malan as well. Because scapegoating is something we do all the time, to try and make ourselves feel better about ourselves. It's actually not ultimately a healthy kind of strategy for well-being.
Look, I've got to say, this book that you've chosen to write about whistleblowers, I think it's such a clever idea. It should make such a really great book.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if it's take my hat off to Molly's courage. It was to stand up to the Boers in 1985 was quite difficult. But I mean, the ongoing South African tradition of that, those people really deserve to be.
They do, and that's in a sense. The funny thing is that I discovered her story looking at these wonderful press clippings that her daughter-in-law, Cheryl, who never even met her mother-in-law, which is now the mother of 4 of her grandchildren. And she thought it was important that their children understood who Molly was. So she had pulled together all this wonderful collation of these things. And I was then at that stage coming to the end of my fight with this Australian mining company who were trying to slap me for 10 million rands for being, speaking the truth about what they were going on about. And I thought I was going to write my book and my story. And then I discovered that Molly had also been the target of a defamation suit brought to her by Lt Fouche. So I thought, well, okay, I'll tell her story as a sort of a preface to my story. Then I got more into it. I said, well, my story can wait. Let me tell her story. And because it's actually not only helped me, it helped me also realize it wasn't actually about me. It wasn't about the whistleblowers, it's not about them. Don't take it too personally.
But this book, as I conceived it, when I conceived it, as it was like a river that flowed among rocks. And the rocks were these discrete stories about, they were all murder stories, because I'd been a crime reporter in my youth in Johannesburg. And I started to put it together, that but I mean, maybe that's something you should think about doing. It's like, start with Molly, have islands in the stream, introduce us to several whistleblowers, and while at the same time telling your story.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, I've got on my YouTube channel, for people who are interested, a whole series of conversations with them about the people that you mentioned, the Zondo Commission people, Cynthia Stipple, Masila Mutepu, Martha Ngoyi, and that. It's been useful because it's now meant that I can, their stories at least heard and it's publicly acknowledged, and it hopefully is some deterrence against retaliation.
What is the URL? I want to go and see.
Yeah, good. Well, I'll send it to you, and you'll keep you busy for a couple of hours. But what's also happened, and I just want to say this because for those who are supporting me, is that I've now also been targeted by one of the adversaries of one of the whistleblowers that I interviewed for having done that. So then I'm trying to shut my YouTube channel down and get me to apologize, to say it's not. And that's just outrageous to think of where we came from in the 80s, when there's the restrictions on media and the terrible things that were happening. One thing we have got going for us is a Bill of Rights, freedom of expression, independent media, etc., access to the courts and all the rest. So, things are a lot better to deal with these big issues than they were that Molly faced. Yet she stood her ground. She did it all, and we've now at least got the story to tell. And there's a big question about whether, in fact, her death was intentional, was a hit, or whether it was just an unfortunate accident. For me, that's almost irrelevant in a sense, in that I'm looking at her life, and all of us, need to accommodate and reconcile ourselves to death whilst we're still alive. And not to see death as something that happens in the future. It's something that can happen to anybody at any moment. And then to just ask yourself the question each day, am I living my life to the full? And that's why I just love meeting your mother, because she's lived 100 years, next week. And death hasn't come knocking yet. You know?
I just want to make a point to my mother that always amazes me. You know, she was born, okay, not a slave, but she was born before women were allowed to vote. The female franchise for white women only came into being, I think, in 1929 in South Africa. And I just think how we take all these things for granted. And all the extraordinary blessings that democracy confers on us is like in its recognition of the dignity of individuals and protections for their rights. You know, because you can't say that democracy really began in all earnest until say in Britain. No, actually anywhere until women were enfranchised, and the working class in Britain, say in 1919, when after World War I, because you know they had property qualifications and it stopped the rebel from voting. So this is, you know, just over 100 years we've had this experiment. And
to wrap up, thank you. I mean, that's been so interesting, and I could carry on and on all day. But your mother needs to be honoured for this, and let you get back to her.
I must. Yeah.
And this is going, I'm going to be calling on you again, and maybe bring your guitar next time, and you can, you know, paar van daardie liedjies wat jy met jou orkes.
I must go and look at this Rian Malan Facebook page. I remember that from about 10 years ago. That somebody. Okay, but I went there once. And I didn't believe in social media. You see, I thought this was all just a passing fad. I mean, and suddenly I woke up one day, everything that was sacred in my life had been destroyed by digital revolution and social media. Not books, but magazines that long form.
Lieve Marie, hier sit winter alweer, en die wind, o jene. Ek lewe al weke, betrap hier binne. Swart Rian hamer teen die vensterruite, en die ys lê 6 stem diep daar buite. En jy weet, op aande soos die, vraag ek myself alweer, alles in ag geneem, wat die hel maak ek hier? Die weer is ellendig, dollar is amper niks werd, en is al pronk in die koerante soos 'n spog by perd. Ek lees jy het self misdaad bekamp, 'n paar jobs geskep, en inflasie op sy kop gestamp. Is dit leens Marie, of is dit werklik waar, soos jy weet? Ek twyfel oor alles in Afrika. Trek boer, o mama, ek wil huis toe gaan. Verlang maar ek is bang vir Afrika, o Afrika. Saterdag het ek vir Piet Passon besoek. Daar was wors en chops en pannekoek en 'n klomp verlore boere wat vriende soek. Almal het bewend langs die braai gestaan terwyl ons gasheer oor die swart gevaar aangaan. Ja, nou Piet kry nog e-mails van sy regse chomme. En hy sê, volgens sy bronne gaan dit nou sleg daaronder. Hy sê, die Mandela jare was net 'n witte brood en oor die langtermyn maak hulle al die wit mense dood. Ek was lekker getrek, so ek sê vir hom, Piet ou maat, jy's my vriend, maar eish, dis bog wat jy praat. Ons is net bang om te erken ons het fout gemaak en Suid-Afrika verniet verlaat. En ja, uit my gedonder. Trek boer, o mama, ek wil huis toe gaan. Verlang maar ek is bang vir Afrika, o Afrika. Trek boer, o mama, ek wil huis toe gaan. Verlang maar ek is bang vir Afrika, o Afrika. Jy weet Marie, toe ek emigreer, ek het gelief toe ek sê dat ek niks omgee. Ek dink aan jou gedurig, amper elke dag. En ek droom van jou in die eindelose, dodelike nag. Ek droom van die maanlig daar in Stellenbosch. Ons twee loop huis toe, na 'n job by die troos. En daar is iets valt in jou oë, jy sê jy wil liefde maak. En ons kruip weg in die donker, daar langs Dorpstraat. En ek droom van 'n strand, met met ijslike wit branders, son op my rug en jou lyf onder my hande. Lê op my bed, luister maar die papy, stryk uit my hand en daar lê jy langs my. En ag Marie, ek wens alles kon anders wees, maar jy is 'n optimis en ek's nou Kanadees. So ek wil net verneem, hoe gaan dit met jou? En vra of jy ook nog vir my onthou. Die ewe trekboer.